In the last lecture, we examined the erroneous argument that some voluntary exchanges hurt one of the exchanging parties. We saw that this view is particularly harmful when it leads governments to restrict exchange with those in the underdeveloped world. Let's now turn to a second argument for why restricting voluntary exchanges could benefit society. This objection is a close cousin of the argument we examined in the last lecture. However, this objection accepts the idea that voluntary exchange isn't exploitation. Instead, it argues that something about trade changes when we draw a political line in the proverbial sand. The objection goes like this. Is it possible that allowing free international trade could cause our society to become poorer? After all, can't we protect domestic employment if we prevent exchange with foreigners? If we can decrease trade with foreigners, we'll surely strengthen domestic production. What's not to like? Perhaps voluntary exchanges don't make our society wealthier after all. This view frequently describes international trade using military metaphors. For instance, trade with China is described as warfare. Those who subscribe to this view see the U.S. as losing in its trade relationships with China. Similarly, adherents of this position advocate returning to a fair trading relationship with China or other nations. In this view, fairness usually involves public policies, which would protect our domestic industries from foreign competition. To sum it up, this view holds that our international trading partners are stealing our jobs and making us poor in the process. Trade is war. The conclusion is that we could make ourselves better off by restricting the number of Chinese goods that we consume. The preferred policy to achieve this outcome is almost always tariffs, which are just taxes on foreign-produced goods. Such tariffs make it less profitable for foreigners to sell in our country, which means domestic purchases and employment will rise, or so the argument goes. If you find that conclusion compelling, you might be surprised to learn that few policy issues garner as much consensus among economists as does their belief that tariffs don't make our society, or any society, wealthier on the whole. Before I give you the evidence, here's a few quick caveats. Governments obviously have to raise money somehow. This isn't about the best way for a government to acquire funds. We're also not interested here in other arguments for tariffs, such as whether they're important to national defense. Here, we're simply interested in the question of whether a tariff is a suitable policy tool for increasing a nation's wealth. And economists answer that question with a resounding and unanimous no. Here's my evidence for that claim. Take a look at this slide. In 2018, the University of Chicago's Initiative on Global Markets poll asked about 50 leading economists to respond to a statement that said, imposing new U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum will improve Americans' welfare. Not a single economist agreed with that statement. 24% of these responding economists merely disagreed, while the other 76% strongly disagreed. What explains this opposition to tariffs? Or to put it more positively, what's the case for free trade? Let's look at the second question first, then we'll come back to how tariffs make our society poorer on the whole. By this point, if you've been following this lecture series, you should not be surprised by how economists ground their thinking about international trade. Seeing how free international trade makes us wealthier requires that you look through the opportunity cost lens. In a nutshell, the opportunity cost lens shows us that even when Tom is more productive than Bill, Tom still benefits from specializing and then exchanging with Bill. The same holds true at the country level. That's an abstract principle, but I think it's easy to grasp with a few concrete examples. We'll start at the individual level and work our way up to the country level. So here's a classic example offered by economist Kenneth Boulding in his text, Economic Analysis. He writes, a doctor who is an excellent gardener may very well prefer to employ a hired man who, as a gardener, is inferior to himself, because thereby he can devote more time to his medical practice. What's Boulding getting at? Well, when a brain surgeon tends to his garden, he sacrifices the chance to use that time to perform brain surgeries, for which he charges a pretty penny. That's his opportunity cost. If our brain surgeon wants to maximize his income, it may make sense for him to pay a gardener, even if the doctor has more of a green thumb than the gardener himself. This arrangement makes the rest of society better off too. After all, we gain from this doctor conducting life-saving surgeries. We'd rather have him in the hospital than in his garden. I like to illustrate this principle to my students with a now debunked witticism that was originally attributed to the Beatles' John Lennon. Though Lennon never said this, it's humorously been turned into a meme. Here it is. You can see what's going on. A reporter asks John Lennon if Ringo is the best drummer in the world. Lennon replies, "He's not even the best drummer in the Beatles." Of course, this conversation never happened, but even if it had, and if Lennon was telling the truth, it still might make sense for Ringo to be the Beatles' drummer. Why? Because the Beatles would sacrifice so much by putting John, Paul, or George on the drums. They simply wouldn't be the Beatles anymore. Likewise, if our brain surgeon spends all of his time in the garden simply because he's better than the local gardener, we wouldn't get brain surgeries anymore. Let's now take these basic principles and apply them to international trade. People in the United States benefit from exchanging with people in China, even though Americans are more productive than Chinese laborers on average. In the example I just gave, they're the brain surgeon. And not because of any inherent differences between the two peoples, but only because the Americans have better machines and a better institutional environment within which to work. Now, when people in the United States buy steel from Chinese producers, it means US workers don't have to devote their own labor and resources to steel production. Instead, they can devote it to something else, like computer programming or growing wheat, two things that Americans are very good at doing. Thus, when Americans trade with the Chinese, there is more steel, more tech, and more wheat for citizens in both countries to enjoy. It's just like the case where our brain surgeon trades with the gardener. If you're still not convinced, here are two more of my favorite stories for showing how trade makes us wealthier. First, think of a family instead of a country. Suppose it's the hypothetical Smith family. The Smith family's dad gets it in his head the Smiths will be better off if they only buy from one another. That way, no income ever leaves the family. He also recognizes what he thinks is an additional benefit. Everyone in the family will always have a job, full employment for the Smith family. To secure these benefits, he decides to forbid all exchanges with anyone outside the immediate Smith family. We might call this dad a tyrant, but that's really beside the point from an economic perspective. What else can we say using the opportunity cost lens? Well, we can say that it won't take long for this family to become incredibly poor. If they're sick, they can't exchange with a doctor. They have to produce medicine themselves. If they want more clothes, they'd better learn to be content with what they can make on their own. Want an education? Forget that. The Smith family will have to independently rediscover any knowledge they want to acquire because they cannot exchange for a teacher's services. Does anyone really think that the Smith family will rediscover the fundamental theorem of calculus on their own? Interestingly enough, my example is not pure conjecture. We have good empirical evidence of what happens when a family becomes cut off from all exchange opportunities. In the early 20th century, a Russian family of 6 called the Lykovs fled their tiny town of Lykova to escape religious persecution, which was heavily targeting adherents of the Russian Orthodox faith. They ended up in South Siberia, where they remained isolated for 42 years until a team of geologists stumbled on them. Here's a picture of 3 members of the Lykov family when they were discovered in 1978. This picture shows them after the geologists had given them fresh outfits. That was necessary because when this team of scientists found the Lykovs, they were in terrible health, living in a small cabin with tattered clothes and regularly eating only 3 or maybe 4 different foods. That's what happens to your living standard when you can't exchange. The way I like to put it is kind of like the following. Trade is the primary means by which humans cope with the scarcity of resources that we saw in Lecture 2. Without exchange, scarcity dooms the human race to grinding poverty. Exchange, by contrast, opens the door to material prosperity. Now apply this same logic, this same intuition to a country like the United States. In essence, we're just one big and pretty unhappy at this point family. Of course, we wouldn't be as poor as the Lykovs if we stopped exchanging with people in other countries. There's 320 million of us. But we would be poorer than if we did keep exchanging with folks in other countries. It's for this reason that Adam Smith remarks in his 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations, "What is prudence in the conduct of every private family can scarce be folly in that of a great kingdom. If a foreign country can supply us with a commodity cheaper than we ourselves can make it, better to buy it of them with some part of the produce of our own industry." That's just the logic of the brain surgeon and the gardener writ large. Economists David Friedman and Stephen Landsberg tell the second story I want to share about the benefits of international trade. They ask us to imagine an eccentric billionaire inventor, an Elon Musk figure, who makes a startling announcement. The entrepreneur proclaims he's invented a machine that can produce cars using only a little labor and one other ingredient. That's it. Now that's crazy enough on its own, but it gets even more fantastic when our inventor says that the only other input for his car-making scheme is wheat. Of course, no one believes him. No one, that is, until he starts ordering thousands of tons of wheat from Kansas farmers. The wheat gets shipped to his West Coast factory, and to everyone's amazement, cars begin rolling off the assembly line only a few weeks after the first wheat shipments arrive. Secrecy surrounds the entrepreneur's operations. Except for a few workers who've signed non-disclosure agreements, no one is allowed into this factory to see the magical wheat-to-cars machine. The average American is thrilled. The crazy entrepreneur's cars are higher quality, they get better gas mileage, and they're cheaper than Detroit's vehicles. Not only are car buyers thrilled, but Kansas wheat farmers are ecstatic due to their new buyer. Of course, the only people who don't love it are the Detroit automakers, who see a predictable slump in their sales. Finally, curiosity gets the better of an investigative journalist. He sneaks into the factory to get a peek at the machine. To his amazement, he finds the building completely empty. He walks to the back of this massive structure that he'd taken to be a factory just a few moments ago. Another door opens up onto a loading dock, and what does he see? Wheat being loaded onto giant ships. The ships are making their way to Japan, where the entrepreneur trades the grain in exchange for Toyotas and Hondas, which he loads onto the ship in place of the grain it had been carrying. Once the ship is back in the States, the entrepreneur unloads it and sells the cars to eager American buyers. When our mischievous journalist publishes his report, many Americans become outraged that the Japanese are putting Detroit automakers out of a job. In a fit of protectionist fury, they sweep a pro-tariff candidate into the presidency, a man who promises to make trade with Japan fair, a man who promises that we'll stop losing in our trade relationships, a man who promises a so-called trade war. What's the moral of this story? Well, if Americans liked the cars when they thought they were coming from a magical machine, they ought to still be thrilled even when their fantasies are revealed as being just that, fantasies. International trade should thrill us just as much as the magical wheat-to-cars machine. In other words, trade is just another technology for producing the things we want. That's the basic argument for why free trade makes the world a wealthier place. In a nutshell, we don't have to produce all the goods and services we want to consume. Having discussed how trade makes us wealthier, let's now peer through the opportunity cost lens once again to examine how tariffs make our society poorer on the whole. Let's start by asking the first question that's on the minds of many as they view this. What about those Detroit car makers who lose their jobs in the story of the magical wheat-to-car machine? Some people, like the popular writer Orrin Cass, even argue that tariffs help to secure robust, middle-class families, the sorts of folks who are working for the Detroit automakers. Is this claim justified? I don't think so. Take the case of steel tariffs, which have been politically popular in recent times. Yes, steel tariffs can indeed secure some domestic steelworkers' jobs, but this policy would come with an opportunity cost. After all, if steelworkers do lose their job through trade, they don't become permanently unemployed. They find other employment. The machines and the land they're sitting on start getting used to produce other items that we desire. Without the tariffs, we get both cheap foreign steel and whatever these workers could produce instead. I, of course, don't want to minimize the suffering of someone who loses their income as a result of trade with people in other nations. But it's important to understand a few points about this event. First, someone losing their job from international trade is no different, from an economic perspective, than someone losing their job as a result of the normal, competitive process that characterizes all free economies. The alternative to this competitive process is public policy that freezes all producers in their current lines of production and employment, leading to complete economic stagnation. Losing your job isn't fun, but it's better in the long run than living in a static system that does not allow for innovation. Secondly, the empirical evidence across many centuries, in fact, suggests that even displaced workers experience a higher living standard from trade over the long run. I'll give you one example. With the invention of mechanized looms during the Industrial Revolution, many textile workers lost their jobs. But it wasn't long before their real standards of living rose due to the falling price of clothing, which the mechanized loom brought about. So who's to say what the true cost of protecting the U.S. steel industry is? All we can say with confidence is that American steel workers and machines would go produce something else if there's no tariff protection. But we won't get that something else if workers and machines are trapped into producing steel by the protective tariffs. Of course, it doesn't take any economic eyeglasses to see that we could save jobs in the domestic steel industry by preventing Americans from buying cheap and better foreign steel. We also could have saved jobs in the horse and buggy industry by tossing Henry Ford in jail for innovating the way he did. What would the opportunity cost of this production be? Well, protecting the buggy industry means we'd never have gotten the car. But that's not the only channel through which tariffs impoverish us. When a tariff raises the cost of steel, that crimps every domestic steel-using producer. They're unable to produce as much without access to the cheaper foreign steel. Many of them adjust by laying off workers, including middle-class folks, which tariffs are supposedly implemented to help. In the case of the recent round of steel tariffs in the U.S., this isn't simply speculation on my part. A paper by economists Aaron Flane and Justin Pierce estimates that the March 2018 steel and aluminum tariffs eliminated around 75,000 manufacturing jobs across the U.S. economy. Of course, jobs are not valuable for their own sake. We saw that in Lecture 1 of this series. Jobs are valuable when they produce things that help us achieve our goals. So the question here is, what would those individuals have been producing if their jobs hadn't been eliminated? And what would they have done with their incomes if those hadn't evaporated? With our economic eyeglasses, we realize that the argument for tariffs is just the broken window fallacy all over again. What might those laid off workers have done with their salaries if they hadn't been laid off? Maybe they would have started their own businesses. Maybe they'd have invested in someone else's enterprise. Who knows? This is why I say tariffs don't contribute to preserving healthy middle-class families, at least not on net. The tariff might benefit some middle-class families, but at the expense of other middle-class families. And it's easy to see the families who benefit from the tariff. It takes our economic eyeglasses to detect all the other families who lose when tariffs are imposed. This brief discussion of steel tariffs allows us to answer a question that should be on your mind. If tariffs make us worse off And if economists repeatedly warn about them, why do virtually all governments impose them? Let's take the case of U.S. sugar tariffs. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that there are only 10 U.S. sugar producers. They're shielded from foreign competition by tariffs. Now imagine that a senator from a state that doesn't produce any sugar, let's say Maine, proposes a repeal of the tariffs. After all, he argues, without the tariffs, Americans will be able to enjoy cheaper, higher quality foreign sugar. If the government listens to this senator and repeals the tariff, every sugar consumer in the U.S., which is everyone, by the way, will be a bit wealthier because we'll purchase the cheaper foreign sugar. Meanwhile, here's the key point to understand, the 10 sugar producers stand to lose millions from repealing the tariff. Now, who do you think will show up to argue their case before Congress? The consumers, who each stand to gain, let's say, $10 annually from sugar tariff repeal, or the sugar producers, who stand to lose millions every single year? To ask that question is to answer it. The sugar producers will hire lobbyists. They'll develop economically erroneous, pro-tariff arguments for the relevant congressional subcommittee. They may even offer bribes in countries where corruption is prevalent. This fateful situation is what economists call the logic of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. Tariffs concentrate large benefits on the 10 sugar producers. And sure, they pay a bit more for sugar in their role as consumers, but it's dwarfed by the income they get from tariffs as producers. Meanwhile, the cost of the tariffs in the form of slightly higher sugar prices is dispersed across 320 million sugar-consuming Americans. The costs are also borne by any other American producer who uses sugar, and quite a few of them do. But to any individual consumer, the cost is fairly small. Would you march to Washington to campaign for sugar to be a few cents cheaper? Certainly not. As a result, we tend to get competition-restricting tariffs, even though our society would be wealthier without them. So far, we've learned an important truth. Trade is not war. But there is a connection between trade and actual warfare, and once again, you can see it by looking through the opportunity cost lens. Economists have long argued that trade between nations is a powerful deterrent to war. No one's quite sure who said it, but I love this powerful and concise 19th century aphorism. If goods don't cross borders, armies will. Only someone looking through the opportunity cost lens would express this sentiment. Why? Well, trade between countries raises the opportunity cost of violent conflict. If the two countries' citizens are engaged in trade, war will cause their living standards to fall. The specter of falling living standards, in turn, may cause citizens to put pressure on their political leaders to avoid conflict. This opportunity cost insight has empirical support. In a 2007 paper, Jun Zhang and his co-authors examined the relationship between international trade and warfare. Their paper controls for a host of variables, such as whether the trading countries possess democratic governance. They find that trade between nations has what they call a significant pacifying effect on the country's tendency to initiate conflict. That finding makes sense, given that war will eliminate many, if not all, gains from trade that the citizens of these countries enjoy. Today we've seen that trade is not war. War results in mutual impoverishment. Trade results in mutual enrichment. Additionally, we've seen that impeding trade through tariffs makes us poorer and lowers the opportunity cost of initiating actual warfare. And if you remember back to my first lecture, you'll recall that warfare also makes us poorer overall. Score another point for trade. Over the course of the last two lectures in this series, we've seen how exchange makes people better off. But we haven't yet addressed many other questions that people have about markets. For example, many people wonder if markets open the door to nasty things like fraud and discrimination. In short, doesn't just about anything go in unregulated markets? It's that critical question which I'll address in the next and final lecture.